I'm moderating. So, good morning. Welcome to the high-level dialogue with Ruben Meniktivela, UNHCR's Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, on a route-based approach to address mixed movements of refugees and migrants. Ruben, it's lovely to have you here. Welcome. This morning, you will remember we had an online poll, according to which ensuring safe and regular protection pathways ranked as the first topic which should be prioritized in the migration agenda in the coming years. So it is really a pleasure to have you here and to be able to address the issue of safe, regular protection pathways. When we hear the news today, the news is not good. It is riddled with crises and conflicts over the world, from Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine to civil unrest in Sudan and the escalation of violence in the Middle East. Drivers of forced displacement seem to be on the increase once again. At the same time, we see, of course, the continued lack of study and employment opportunities for many people, persisting socioeconomic inequalities across different economies, and the increasing impact of climate change on people's livelihoods and well-being. All of this continue to push people to leave their countries in search of a better life. The majority move regularly, we know, but a significant number of people also use irregular channels. Now, today, in this spirit, this year's Vienna Migration Conference dedicates 3 sessions to more recent developments in the global approach to protection. Right now, this first session will look into UNHCR's route-based approach to mixed movement flows as a means to strengthen protection and find solutions in the context of mixed movements of refugees and migrants. A panel later today will unpack the understandings and the divisive themes in what has broadly been framed as external processing of asylum, external asylum processing. And finally, we will have a third session, a panel that looks at resources along migratory routes that inform migrants and refugees about the dangers of irregular migration and the opportunities to access regular pathways that provide support and counseling, and even that can foresee the referral and processing of applications along the routes. So all of that is to come. But right now, I am happy to welcome, once again, Ruben Meniktivela, UNHCR Assistant High Commissioner for Protection. Ruben, you took up your appointment in January 2024. You served as the director of the UNHCR's New York office from February 2020 to December 2023. Prior to this, you held the position of UNHCR representative in Pakistan from 2017 to 2020, and you also served as the UNHCR representative in Thailand. Your career with UNHCR spans a period of 36 years and includes a range of functions at UNHCR headquarters as well as in Thailand, Turkmenistan, and the United States. You have a degree in law, a Bachelor of Laws and a Master of Laws in European Community and Public International Law from the University of Paris 2. So you have all the right access, insights, knowledge, and experience to share your insights today with us. We have about 20 minutes for conversation with the Assistant High Commissioner, and after that, if time allows, I will take a few questions. So to start with, I want to have your insights and your thoughts and talk with you about the available protection spaces and where we stand with the Global Compact on Refugees. Now, I said in the beginning, we're witnessing a volatile geopolitical landscape, and of course, that has an impact on available protection spaces for people in need of international protection. So, how do you see that impacting available protection spaces? How do you observe global solidarity rolling out in this volatile geopolitical landscape? And has the Global Compact on Refugees shown progress to close protection gaps that we observe through its 4 pillars? Just for ease of reference, those pillars being easing pressure on hosting communities, countries, enhancing refugee self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions, and support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and in dignity. So where do you see room for improvement? Thank you.
Thanks, Sedef. First of all, of course, now it's a clearly established fact from Sedef reading my CV that I'm a really, really old person. But
that was not the intention.
With age does come experience and, well, hopefully wisdom as well. Just to answer your, first of all, can I just say thank you very much to ICMPD for inviting us to this conference and for hosting us in this amazing venue. As a refugee protection person, this is definitely not my usual habitat. So I'm really, really grateful to be here. On the last element of that question, just on the Global Refugee Compact, the reason why I'm starting with this is because yesterday at dinner, I did hear a question from someone when Nicole was having her fireside chat, where they said, well, is the 1951 Convention still relevant today? I just want to start with saying the 1951 Convention and its 67 Protocol, and some of you have heard me say this before, are the foundation of the international refugee protection regime. They have saved millions of lives in the past. They will continue to save millions of lives in the future because the provisions of those conventions are as valid today as they were almost 75 years ago when they were drafted. Let there be no mistake on that. But what the Global Refugee Compact did in 2018 was to recognize the fact that when the conventions were drafted, when the 1951 Convention was drafted 70 plus years ago, the drafters could not possibly have foreseen some of the intervening issues that have arisen in the 70 plus years that this convention has been in existence. One, the fact, for example, that most of the world's refugees, 75% of them, are living in low-income and middle-income countries. So, and that is, you know, we are talking about 43 million refugees, and as you can imagine, 75% of that is a huge number. And this is a responsibility that is being borne disproportionately by some of the countries that are least able to actually host these refugees. The second is the protracted nature of the displacement cycle. In 1951, when the convention was drafted, this was in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it was much more about ensuring that people who had been displaced as a result of the Second World War could find solutions to their problems. Nobody expected that refugee cycles could become as protracted as they are today. So if you just mentioned the fact that I was a representative in Pakistan, Pakistan saw its first Afghan refugees coming into the territory in 1979. 40 plus years later, they're still hosting 1.6 million Afghan refugees. And those are the registered refugees. There are an equal number of Afghans who are living in an unregistered situation in that country. This was definitely not situations that the drafters of the convention ever thought of. There's other elements as well. For example, the fact that climate change was going to be an aggravating factor when it came to the drivers of forced displacement. All of these issues have arisen. I mean, you know, the drafters couldn't possibly have foreseen these. Since they're not Bulgarian and did not get into fortune telling, they were really looking at situations that they were being confronted with in the immediate present. But 70 plus years later, what the Global Refugee Compact tried to do was to address these issues and coming out with very clear provisions on, or engagements on responsibility sharing, so alleviating the responsibilities that host governments have been bearing for so long. The second was recognizing the fact that climate change can be an aggravating factor for forced displacement, recognizing the fact that refugees in protracted situations do need to achieve a measure of self-reliance, that they cannot be dependent on humanitarian aid for 40 plus years, recognizing that solutions are absolutely imperative. whether it is creating conditions in the countries of origin so that refugees can repatriate voluntarily in conditions of safety and dignity, or solutions in third countries, which is resettlement or complementary pathways, including labor mobility and some of the schemes that previous panelists have been talking about as well. So these are issues that were being dealt with by the Compact. And yes, short answer to your question is the Compact has, since its adoption 6 years ago, we have seen improvements. One is the whole of society approach. The convention is essentially all about responsibilities of governments and UNHCR's role in assisting those governments. The Compact is much more about the entire society getting together to resolve refugee issues. So whether you're talking the regional or the international financial institutions like the World Bank, the regional development banks, whether you're talking about the private sector, whether you're talking about academia, whether you're talking about faith-based organizations, whether you're talking about the refugees themselves, because they are contributing to their own solutions in many parts of the world. The Compact really recognized that all of these different stakeholders had a role to play, and that they should all be working together collectively to try and identify solutions to the problems of refugees. And what the Compact has done through the 2 global refugee fora that were convened in 2019 and in December last year was to bring all of these different actors together to come up with concrete pledges or commitments. So this is not about a conference where everybody came together, they made some wonderful statements, and then they went off and forgot everything that they had actually committed to. These are actual concrete pledges that they're being held to. So next year we will have a high-levels official meeting where all of the entities that made these pledges are going to be told, please tell us how far you have come in implementing them. So it's very much a stock-taking conference that we're going to be holding. And what we have seen are massive changes. In the pledges just in December last year, governments, but also the private sector, committed to something like $2.2 billion in additional funding for refugee situations. Lots of private sector companies actually made specific commitments for providing employment to refugees. Lots of legal organizations and others essentially basically committed to providing pro bono services, free legal services for asylum seekers, but also for governments with asylum processes that are not entirely meeting international standards. So building asylum capacity, but also helping asylum seekers to present their claims properly. So these are just a glimpse, if you like, of the different types of pledges that were made in these different fora. And many of these entities are living up to these pledges. And we will see much more of a comprehensive picture next year when we actually issue the indicator report, where all of these pledges are going to be publicized, and also the progress towards implementation. Having said that, there are still areas that require improvement. I mean, we have clearly not solved the refugee problem. We are not going to be able to solve it without these collective endeavors. But some of perhaps the things that we really do need to focus on are the solutions. You know, we can alleviate the responsibility or the burden borne by hosting countries. We can do whatever we can to make sure that refugees are self-reliant in these countries of asylum so that they can contribute to the economy. But we still haven't been able to effectively identify solutions. The best solution, the most durable solution, is peace, and we are far from seeing that in many of the conflict situations that we are facing right now. The Ukraine war is going into its 3rd year. The Sudan war is going into its 2nd year. We are just seeing what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories and now in Lebanon as well, and we do not see an end in sight to any of these conflicts. So what we are seeing is possibly an increase in the 122 million people who are already forcibly displaced in the world today. And that is where we really do need to be focusing on. It's really on solutions. Perhaps not in resolving the wars, that's, I think, beyond the remit of us here, but at least looking at third country solutions, whether it's increasing resettlement quotas, whether it's looking at labor mobility, education pathways, family reunification, all of these things are within our remits here collectively to look at, to try and really achieve some kind of solutions for these people. And also, yes, absolutely, working with countries of origin to stabilize the populations in those countries, that is also part of UNHCR's mandate. We are supposed to be working with countries to create conditions that are conducive to the voluntary return of refugees, but that also means creating conditions that prevent people from being forced to flee in the first place. And we are certainly prepared to play our role, but we also need the whole of society approach in regard to those solutions as well.
Thank you very much. Since we are in Europe, I'd like to also ask you where Europe stands as a whole in the pledges and the commitments regarding the Global Compact. So, and of course, then I do also want to ask you about the UNHCR's route-based approach, but if you can maybe say a few words on I mean, we've heard from the ministers, just a panel before about the pact, of course, EU Pact on Migration and Asylum and their plans of implementation. But I'd be interested to hear from you, yeah, as I've said, where Europe stands when it comes to commitments and pledges. Yeah.
I think what a lot of the EU member states have done is to make commitments in relation to host countries and how to reinforce the ability of these host countries to continue to host these refugees. There's millions of refugees that they have been hosting now for several decades. Much of it goes into things like reinforcing their ability, providing additional humanitarian assistance, but also making sure that some of these solutions are made available to them. The United States, for example, has increased its resettlement quota. I think the current resettlement quota for the United States, and we cannot thank them enough, is 159,000 slots. That's huge for a country that's also grappling with a huge number of direct arrivals of asylum seekers. We would like to see more countries making those same engagements and making those same commitments. But we have also seen certain countries in the European Union making these same engagements. Italy, for example, is right now initiated this labor mobility scheme where they are actually encouraging Italian firms to train refugees. Right now, these are pilot schemes that are being done in Jordan, Egypt, and Uganda, where refugees are being trained by these Italian companies in specific skills, whether it's craftsmanship, whether it's IT, whether it's shipmaking, with the commitment that once these refugees have acquired these skills, they will actually be recruited for work by the Italian companies in Italy. Now, we would like to see more of these types of schemes coming up. We know that, for example, the United Kingdom is looking at the healthcare sector because there is a dearth of workers in that sector, and they're looking to training refugees to be able to take on those functions and arrive in the UK through legal pathways to find that solution there. So these are the kinds of things that certain of the European, not just the EU members, but European states are actually doing right now as well.
Thank you. I want to talk about UNHCR's route-based approach. This has been recently adopted and with the aim to contribute towards the goal to shift towards more humane and effective responses, concrete actions and develop concrete actions to counter smuggling and trafficking and delivering better outcomes for those on the move, affected communities and states alike. So with these objectives, with these goals in mind, how do you see the route-based approach contributing towards these goals?
Thank you, Sedef. I think the reason why the route-based approach was something that we really initiated, or actually, formalized, because we have been looking at different elements of this for several years now, was the fact that we understood that migrants and refugees were using the same routes, sometimes also using the same traffickers and smugglers, and basically that both of these different categories of populations required solutions that met their specific needs. And what we also realized was that in the absence of a comprehensive migration management strategy, migration management was literally been left in the hands of criminal networks. And you heard Nicole yesterday saying it's not migration that's the problem, it's migration management. And you also heard Nikolaus today basically saying we cannot leave migration management in the hands of traffickers and smugglers. And that's entirely correct. And what the route-based approach is trying to do is essentially to address some of these burning issues of the day and essentially ensure that people on the move, regardless of their motives for moving, are able to find solutions to their problems. For refugees, it's of course protection and assistance, but also for migrants, it's to be able to ensure legal pathways at the earliest possible stage of their journey. And this involves different clusters of countries. And I have to say, sometimes when I expound on this, a lot of governments and also some of our other interlocutors going like, yeah, but isn't this old wine in new bottles? I mean, have you not been doing this for the last 70+ years anyways? Yes, we have. We have been doing a lot of these activities, but in isolation of each other. We have never taken a holistic or panoramic view of this as the High Commissioner describes it. So what we're talking about essentially is starting from the countries of origin, basically, as I previously said, working with development actors, working with the governments to ensure that conditions are not just conducive to the return of refugees in voluntary manner, but also ensuring that people are not compelled to flee in the first place, whether it's on grounds of persecution, conflict, or violence, to ensure that we are able to address these root causes so that people don't feel compelled to flee. So that's the first cluster of countries that we're dealing with as part of the route-based approach. The second cluster of countries we're dealing with are countries of first asylum. Pakistan is a typical example of that. As I said, Pakistan has been hosting Afghan refugees for 40 plus years. Humanitarian funding is drying up because a lot of our traditional donors are going like, wait a minute, you know, we've been funding your programs for the refugees, for health, education sectors for 40 plus years. UNHCR, you need to find a different way of funding now because we have other humanitarian crises that we also need to be looking at. So that means we are going to be giving you less money for the protracted refugee situations. That is where we have been encouraging institutions like the World Bank, like the regional development banks, like some of the development agencies of the UN system to come in and invest to help not just the refugees in these countries, but also the host communities, because we recognize that much of the time refugees and host communities are in the same extremely dire, precarious socioeconomic situation. So if we are helping one community, we do have to help the other community as well. And this is what the World Bank has been doing now since 2018. They have disbursed something like $5.5 billion to countries, for countries of first asylum, hosting significant populations, and basically saying, look, and it's a completely bilateral thing. UNHCR is not a repository of any of this funding. The funding goes directly to the governments, and it is essentially in three sectors: health, education, and access to livelihoods. And in certain other operations, they also provide funding for documentation of refugees, etc. But it is essentially to stabilize these populations, both the refugees and the host communities, ensure that refugees have access to the basic services, that they have some kind of future so that they don't feel compelled to move onwards, looking to other countries along that route to provide them with the services that they're no longer able to achieve in their countries of first asylum. So that is how we are trying to address the second cluster of countries. The third cluster of countries are the countries of transit. And there, of course, it tends to be much more, we have a somewhat more fraught conversation, certainly with some of the countries in North Africa, for example, which are typically transit routes for asylum seekers and refugees and migrants trying to access the European Union, the border states. But there, what we're trying to say is convincing the governments of these countries to set up multi-purpose hubs, essentially one-stop shops where refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers can obtain information and counseling regarding legal options that they have for access to protection and assistance and basic services. And these one-stop shops would also provide options, including things like complementary pathways, but also return, because we do understand that return has to be a vital component of this approach. So that's essentially for the transit countries. And then, of course, the destination countries, essentially countries in the global north, but not just countries in the global north. The Republic of South Africa is now facing a significant problem of refugees and migrants accessing the asylum systems as the only way of being able to remain in South Africa legally. So they are actually facing some of the same problems that, for example, EU member states are facing right now. So all this to say that mixed population movements are not just a European phenomenon, they're actually occurring in other parts of the world as well. So for destination countries, what we're basically saying is that once an asylum seeker or a refugee arrives at your territory and seeks asylum, they have to be mandatorily able to access the asylum processes there. And then, of course, be subject to fair, fast, and efficient asylum processing. And we do put that emphasis on fast as well. We understand that extended and protracted asylum processes attract malified asylum seekers. We certainly don't want that to happen. And then for those who are determined to be in need of international protection, we obviously expect the destination countries to provide them with those solutions, but also, and vitally, for those deemed not to be in need of international protection, we also are committed to engaging, as long as it's not incompatible with our mandate, in ensuring or negotiating alongside the destination countries with countries of origin in terms of the return of these rejected asylum seekers. But also, and also the readmission of refugees who may have effectively found asylum in a country along that route, and where we can assist in obtaining the readmission of these refugees to their countries of first asylum, we are prepared to do that as well, with the caveat, of course, that these activities have to be compatible with our mandate. And then finally, for destination countries, it's really telling them, please invest upstream. Invest in the countries of first asylum. Invest in ensuring that the refugees there are able to access basic services, have some form of future, so that they don't feel compelled to move in your direction. Invest in countries of origin to ensure that you are able to stabilize conditions in those countries, to ensure that refugees are not compelled to move for reasons of persecution, conflict, or violence, and that returning refugees are able to sustain their return and remain in their countries of origin and not feel compelled to move out a second time because of the conditions there. Typically, this is what we're also talking about in terms of Syria. I've heard now lots of remarks being made about forced return to Syria. That is something that UNHCR vehemently opposes, but we do recognize that a certain number of Syrian refugees are returning spontaneously. We want to ensure that those returnees are able to remain in Syria and not feel obligated to move out a second time. And we are encouraging early recovery investment by many of the member states present here, but also by others outside of the region, to invest in early recovery programs in countries like Syria to stabilize the populations there, to prevent further outflows of those populations. So that's the route-based approach in a nutshell.
Thank you very much for making us understand the novelty in the route-based approach. I think it's all very clear. And of course, as there is no one recipe for all, no quick fixes, UNHCR is focusing on a number of routes you have mentioned, one of them being the Central Mediterranean route. And considering also the audience here in the room, we're running over time, but I'd still like to ask you, you've mentioned also, as I've said, some of the elements you wish to see on the route. But do you perceive states and other key stakeholders to be on board with this approach, and or do you observe certain limitations? What are those limitations, if any? Especially if we can specifically talk about the Central Mediterranean route, from I think where you're focusing upon right now.
No, absolutely. I have to say that last week we had our annual executive committee session, which is like our version of the UN General Assembly, and we had a side event on the route-based approach, which had to be the best attended side event ever, despite the fact that it took place at 8:30 in the morning. We had a huge number of ministers and heads of delegations and ambassadors attending that, simply because of the interest in the topic. And it was the reaction was overwhelmingly positive, because I think every single member state concerned sees an advantage in being part of this route-based approach, whether it's the country of origin, countries of first asylum, or countries of destination. And for the Central Mediterranean, we are in discussions. We have presented a white paper to some of the EU institutions in Brussels. We are talking individually with many of the member states, both individually and collectively in the EU as well. And essentially what we would like to see as typical components of the route-based approach involving the Central Mediterranean is first and foremost, of course, again, the investment upstream in the countries of first asylum and in the countries of origin, but also investment in countries of transit to convince these countries to set up these one-stop shops that we would really want to see happening, so that refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants are not compelled to take these incredibly dangerous sea journeys across the Mediterranean. You already know that over 4,000 people lost their lives in the Mediterranean just last year, and we do not want to see these tragedies recurring. So to have effectively upstream investment to prevent these people from moving, but critically multi-purpose hubs in the countries of transit, and also effective search and rescue and disembarkation schemes for people who have already started that sea journey, because again, we do not want to see the kinds of tragedies that we're seeing being perpetuated in the months and years to come. But also then responsibility sharing for those people who are disembarked, so that the frontline states are not going to bear disproportionate responsibility for receiving them. We would also like to see, once refugees and asylum seekers access the EU member states, that they are, as I was saying, subject to the fair, fast, and effective processing. As I said, we would contribute to the return of people not in need of international protection. We would also want to see the countries here upscaling, if you like, some of the existing labor mobility schemes for refugees and asylum seekers, so that they do have regular pathways, that they don't feel compelled to to undertake these dangerous and irregular sea journeys across the Mediterranean. And we would also like to see, obviously, solutions for the refugees who have already found themselves in EU territory. So these are elements that we are still discussing. It's nothing concrete or final just yet, but some of these elements are actually being implemented even as we speak.
Thank you so much. We are a bit over time, but I'm looking at my colleagues to see, I think we're, okay, sorry, we're not able to take questions, but I think we're going over to lunch, so there can be an opportunity to still engage with Ruben over lunch. Thank you so much for this interesting and engaging conversation. You have shed important light on moving towards a more humane and people-centered approach whilst exploring innovative ways of managing mixed movements of refugees and migrants along the routes. Thank you for being with us. It was lovely to have you.
Thank you very much.